Thanks so much. I want to welcome Professor Jesse Jenkins, who's a professor of energy systems engineering at Princeton University and the director of the Zero Lab at Princeton, which produced some of the best analysis of the IRA before and now after it has passed. So welcome, Jesse.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be back with the SOSV crowd.
I want to, start out just by asking the question of the moment, which is 1 year in, how do you feel the IRA is going?
Yeah, I think it's going pretty well. It's an interesting point in time because we really are just at the point where money is starting to flow and the rules have really started to, come into crystallization. I think a lot of folks think the law passes and then, we're off to the races. But of course, what the Inflation Reduction Act does is effectively puts clean energy on sale through a variety of tax credits, grants, loan guarantees, rebate programs, et cetera. And every one of those has to be implemented by a federal agency. The Treasury Department in particular is in charge of all of the tax credits, which is the bulk of the spending and probably impact of the legislation. So they've been working overtime, trying to get through a number of guidances or rulemakings to clarify how a number of the brand new tax credits are going to operate, things like hydrogen tax credits or sustainable fuel credits or other things, as well as all the kind of modifications of the existing credits. So like the wind and solar production tax credits have been around for decades, but the law substantially modifies them, tying in, prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements to claim the full credit, offering new bonus incentives for domestic content and deployment in certain energy communities. So all those rules have to be written, and they're starting to come out. Every week we see new ones coming out. And then if you go over to EPA or to the Department of Energy, which are in charge of a lot of the grant and loan programs, and once again, every one of those programs has to have rules written. They have to have an RFP. They have to get proposals in, and then they have to select the winners of those programs. And so once again, every week there's a new announcement of $1 billion for this and $10 billion for that. And we're starting to get to the phase where some of those grants are being awarded and actually going out the door. And so, it's interesting. This first year is a lot about setting the stage. And really, I think the next 3 years is where we're really going to see like steel in the ground and the rubber meet the road. But what we are seeing is a lot of announced projects. And so that's where we're starting to see the kind of leading indicators of where things are going is, huge number, tens of billions of dollars of announced investment in, everything from wind and solar to manufacturing facilities for batteries and EVs and wind and solar components to hydrogen production facilities, carbon capture pipelines, et cetera. And so, if the goal of the bill was to, kind of put Uncle Sam's thumb on the scale on the side of the clean investments and purchase decisions, it seems like that's what's happening. And we're seeing that response from the private sector and from consumers, adopting electric vehicles and things like that.
I want to go back to this idea of clean energy on sale in a second after a few more questions. But I think let's start by asking what of that whole mix do you feel like is working best right now?
Yeah, I'd say the electric vehicle transition seems to be moving at or faster than the pace that we were projecting or expecting to see. With a pretty strong commitment from the whole industry now to transition. I think the writing's on the wall, both globally and in the United States now, that, by 2030, the majority of vehicles sold are going to be electric in the US and over the majority globally. We're already about a fifth of all vehicles sold throughout the world are electric now or plug-in. And so, these automakers are finally realizing, in some cases reluctantly, but in other cases more proactively, that this is where the future and they need to be investing heavily to make that transition. And consumers are starting to really, the adoption rate is going up. And I think there's lots of, there's lots of hand wringing initially about whether there'll be enough EVs and the supply chain, coming online. Now we're seeing that the supply chain is developed and, auto manufacturers are kind of hitting their production run rates. And now there's hand wringing about there being too many vehicles on the dealer lots. And that's which is it? But, this is a big transition and it's picking up steam. I think we're seeing that in the numbers on a regular basis. The other areas that we're seeing is a huge response on the manufacturing side. So one of the things that IRA is trying to do, in addition to making clean energy just the smart financial decision for businesses and households, is to drive much more production of critical supply chains in the United States or in allied countries. That's to build resilience, but also to create jobs and build the political durability of the legislation, I think, and the clean energy transition more broadly. And so there we're seeing huge, announcements as well. Every week it's like a new manufacturing facility for wind components or solar panels or cells or EV batteries or assembly. And those are spread across a good chunk of the country too. And so there's, quite a diversity in the locations that are benefiting there. It looks like solar PV deployment is on track to double the previous record deployment rate in both this year and next year.
In the U.S.
In the U.S., yeah. So that's really encouraging.
Because I feel like up to now, we haven't had a great sense of how this is going to trickle into the electricity sector.
Yeah, that's right. So we saw about 20 gigawatts of deployment in 2022 of solar PV. I think the EIA is now projecting close to 40 gigawatts per year this year and next year. So that's great. I mean, that's sort of exceeding the pace that we were expecting from our modeling of the Inflation Reduction Act. The flip side of that is that wind is only going at about half of the peak rate that we've seen historically. So we hit about 15 gigawatts in 2020, I believe, of wind deployment. That was right as the production tax credit was sort of winding down. And unlike the solar credit, the investment tax credit, the PTC for wind actually fully expired. And so I think we kind of cleared out the whole pipeline of projects. And we're still rebuilding that now in response to the new policy environment. That plus headwinds around supply chains and siting means that the EIA is projecting only about 6 or 7 gigawatts a year over this year and probably next year as well. And so that's, wind is lagging behind, solar is running ahead, and that, maybe on net we're running about right in terms of new clean electricity supply.
You kind of anticipated my next question, but let me just skip over, what are you nervous about, and kind of ask, how much of that wind slowed? I mean, you kind of just explained it with the wind tax credit expiring, but how much of the wind tepidness we're seeing is from policy factors, and how much of it is from these troubles that the offshore wind companies are having? And even in your projections, were you thinking most of our near-term wind capacity was going to be onshore or offshore? Just what was the mix?
Yeah, we expect most of it to be onshore still. Offshore projects are, gathering steam in response to state mandates and incentives are all up and down the eastern seaboard now. But really, if you look at what's just sort of the most economic, I mean, offshore wind is still quite a lot more expensive than onshore. So really we're seeing that driven by these state policy commitments to try to build these industries up from scratch. Until that's established, that this is going to be, it's going to be fairly expensive to build offshore in the U.S. We have to build whole new, offshore service industries and supply chains to support those industries. The onshore sector is, has been around for a long time, and again, it's gone through booms and busts as the PTC has expired and been extended. I think there is an impact of the fact that we had a full expiration and the supply chain, the pipeline kind of was emptied and now has to be rebuilt. But I don't think that's all of it. If you look at, we saw inflation and real cost increases in, real dollar terms in wind, solar, and lithium ion batteries in 2021 and 2022 for the first time ever, really, since we started, we have these sort of consistent downward cost trajectories for those technologies. And they reversed themselves a little bit in 2022. Already, we're seeing that for batteries and solar, costs are back down again below the 2019 levels and 2021 levels. And so they're kind of back on trend, but that's not true for wind. We're still seeing, price elevation, from inflation and limited supply chain, redevelopment in the wind sector. And it's not clear how much longer that's going to persist. The wind manufacturers were all losing money even before inflation. And so they can't really absorb a lot of that. So yeah, I'm a little worried that, sort of a combination of the greater challenges of siting wind farms, given just how much more visible they are, their reliance on transmission, which they tend to rely on much longer distance lines than solar does on average. And these sort of supply chain, challenges mean that we may have, the wind run rate may be a little lower than would be ideal, or that we would sort of see in an economic optimization.
How much? I mean, you mentioned that one of the ideas of the IRA is to put clean energy on sale. How much is the rate environment affecting any of these deployments? It doesn't seem to be affecting it in EVs. Let's say, if I could editorialize, from what I can tell, the EV deployment's happening, on roughly the rate, I think, on actually an even better rate than one would expect. But in renewables, I've heard it starting to bite. So are we starting to see that? Is that a reason to be concerned?
It is a reason in general to be concerned. I mean, in the sense that almost everything we're talking about, whether it's a heat pump or an EV or a wind or solar farm, is replacing capital for fuel cost. Right? We build a wind farm or a solar farm. It's all upfront capital investment. And then over its life, it displaces a bunch of natural gas or coal-fired power that we would have otherwise needed. And it delivers its savings that way. same with an EV, right? It costs a little more upfront to buy, although the tax credits help knock that down. And then over the life of your, ownership, it's like costs about half as much to, fuel and maintain as a conventional vehicle. Same thing for a heat pump, or efficiency upgrades at your home. And so to the degree that those are all, most of that is financed upfront, having interest rates at 7% as opposed to 2% really does make a pretty significant difference in the relative cost. And you don't see that. I mean, you see its own volatility in the fuel markets, right? We've gone way up, after the war in Ukraine began, and are still elevated relative to that level, but in North America have come quite a ways back down. But it's sort of a different cycle, right? Than we see. Those commodity booms and busts are a little different than what we see for the rate environment. The rate environment tends to persist longer, and hopefully will come back down again in a little while. But for now, it's made all those investments relatively more expensive. And so it's a good thing that we just knocked, 20, 30, 40% off the cost of these projects, because that does help absorb some of that inflation, that interest rate increase.
I have been wondering if they basically are now coming out even.
I mean, that's a good question. I'd have to go do the math on that. I don't think so. I think that the inflation increase is lower than the interest rate increase is less than the incentive value, but I'd have to go do the math on that. That's a good question.
What don't we know yet?
So what I don't think we know is how well we're going to be able to build out the kind of enabling infrastructure that maybe isn't directly supported by IRA, but is induced demand. This
is like transmission,
CO2 pipelines, hydrogen networks. We don't need interstate hydrogen pipelines necessarily, especially not in the near term. But we are going to need to build some industrial clusters that can, harness hydrogen at scale to make cost of production or cost of transport much lower. All of that is sort of indirectly supported by the incentives to produce the fuels and clean electricity or do carbon capture and storage, but much less direct support. We had a little bit of funding in the infrastructure law for transmission lines and for CO2 pipelines, these hydrogen hubs, demonstration programs, but that's all, a few $1 billion that will run out pretty quickly, right? It doesn't take more than a couple transmission lines before you've spent, a couple $1 billion. So those are helpful to get a few initial projects moving, but they're not a substantial direct support. And the other thing that is a limitation of the Inflation Reduction Act is that because it was passed as a budget reconciliation act, it's all about spending money or raising revenue. That you can do a lot with, right? You can create a lot of carrots and or sticks with that kind of program. But what it can't do is establish new institutions or state capacity for planning, for coordination, for all the things that we probably need to make these sort of network economies of scale and all the coordination that goes with that work out at the kind of, the efficiency and pace that we would ideally see. So I'm a little worried about that. Like, we can have our faith in the private market to respond, but I think the reality is that if you look at all other network infrastructure, whether it's, fiber optic or transmission, original electrification and transmission lines of the federal highways or railroads, there's always been a pretty direct role for the federal government in accelerating and coordinating the development of that network infrastructure. And we don't really have that right now, really for any of those sectors, right? I mean, and so that's one area where I think I'm concerned, and we probably need further legislation, further state, further state capacity development, whether that's at the federal level or kind of a public-private, consortia at the regional scale that could help guide this process. I think that's an important area for concern.
It's funny because I think that in the climate world, we got very used to for literally 20 years, 30 years, talking about how the Senate was the obstacle to passing climate policy and like federal climate policy in the United States. And then, of course, like the Senate is where a lot of these ideas came from. It passed IRA before the House did. It was where the final deal was struck over the IRA. And yet we're still running into all these institutional constraints of the Senate, because if it wasn't for the Senate and the reconciliation measures, we would be able to do, the policymakers would have been able to be much more creative with the legislation. Yeah. It's that they're limited to these revenue measures. And it just always tracks back in some ways to how the Senate works.
Where good ideas go to die, as they say.
Yes. There's so much in the IRA that touches on the innovation economy and how the U.S. handles its innovation pipeline. And in some ways, the IRA feels like the second part. I remember us talking about this in 2022 before it passed, but it's like the second half of a lot of ideas that kind of started off in the bipartisan infrastructure law. So just what's that whole set of changes to the kind of US innovation pipeline, and where do they stand now?
Yeah, so I'd say the first thing we should recognize is sort of why we're able to go hard and big on wind and solar and EVs now. Like, why are those the technologies we're talking about so much? And the reason is because 15, 20 years ago, when they were nascent industries that were these sort of expensive alternative energy technologies, as we call them then, governments around the world, from the U.S. to states, in the U.S. to Germany, Japan, Italy, et cetera, decided to create early niche markets to deploy those technologies at scale, whether that was Germany's Energiewende and feed-in tariffs, or our renewable portfolio standards in the U.S., or Denmark's support for commercial wind, et cetera. All of that created initial markets to deploy these technologies at commercial scale, which drives these sort of feedback loops that of all these sorts of causal factors that get reduced down to what we call experience curves or learning curves, right? This sort of correlation that we consistently observe for many technologies, where the more you deploy of it, the more cumulative deployment you have, the cheaper the technology gets on a fairly regular timeline, right? A fairly regular ratio. Mm-hmm. Now, there's a bunch of stuff that actually, is behind that. It kind of shifts, the causal factors shift over time. But what's interesting about it is the recognition that you have to build at scale to kick those things off, right? Yeah. To drive innovation and production at scale, to drive learning by doing in installations and efficiency of labor productivity, all the kinds of things that you learn as you do more and more of it, and you have competitive pressures to get cheaper than your competitor in the market, right? That doesn't happen if there isn't a market. And induced demand for more R&D, right? And whether that's publicly funded or privately funded, that R&D doesn't have anywhere to go and be deployed and tested if there isn't a market for these technologies. And so what that says is we need kind of a full pipeline of support from, yes, early R&D, which has traditionally been the role of government to subsidize basic knowledge and science, but all the way down through demonstration and first-of-a-kind projects, first N-of-a-kind projects, and then ultimately commercial scale deployment of these technologies. And so we're at that commercial scale phase for wind and solar and EVs and lithium-ion batteries only because we did the other stuff earlier. And now we have to basically repeat that kind of full pipeline for all the rest of the solutions we need in the clean energy portfolio, whether that's clean, firm power or long duration battery storage technologies or energy storage that we need to kind of complete the transition to 100% carbon-free electricity and complement wind and solar. Again, all those technologies are, we know what they are, but they're nascent, whether that's, natural gas with carbon capture or advanced geothermal or advanced nuclear or hydrogen, fuel cells or turbines. Like all of those are, we know how to build them, but we have to get a lot better and cheaper at it. We have to make those mature industries that scale. Industrial decarbonization strategies, synthetic liquid fuels, all the sort of additional suite of technologies, carbon capture, hydrogen. And fortunately, the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure law really contain a pretty comprehensive suite of innovation policies to support expanded R&D, demonstration hubs and demo programs for the new Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, Loan Program Office Authority, which was dramatically expanded to sort of underwrite the early first N-of-a-kind deployments of these technologies. Mm-hmm. And then for many of them, the first commercial scale deployment subsidies we've had, whether that's advanced nuclear, which now qualifies on equal footing with all other carbon-free generation for the full wind and solar production tax credits, the same production tax credit that wind and solar have had, or the new hydrogen production tax credit, or an expanded 45Q subsidy for carbon capture and storage. We really have the kind of full suite there for most of the technologies we need. I would say with maybe the exception of a broader focus on industrial decarbonization and agriculture, which are kind of have some initial levels of funding, but are largely left incomplete in the current legislation.
It's funny, that feels like the biggest change in many ways between what you might call like Obamonomics and especially the kind of, Recovery Act of 2009 and just the thinking that went into that law and all the green investment that it fostered. And now, the Biden set of legislation I feel like there was a lot, 10 years ago, we thought we could do a lot by being smart and like having a better technology, like a raw technology than other countries or other companies. And now it feels like the U.S. has recognized, in large part due to China, frankly, right, the importance of scale, and that VHS beats Betamax any day, as Jigar Shah would tell us, and it just matters whether you scale or not.
Yeah, it's kind of remarkable that, I was making the case in 2009, 2010, 2012 that we should be, doing something like IRA then. It was interesting. The mentality in the Recovery Act, which made, 90 billion plus investment over a few years in the clean economy, the biggest to date, was that this was a temporary intervention, right? It was about economic stimulus. It was about shovel-ready projects. Yeah, there was some case to be made that it was a down payment on further, clean energy investment, but that the mortgage never got paid on the down payment, right? And in contrast, China used that same time period to implement a very robust industrial policy strategy to basically dominate over the next 5 years wind, solar, and batteries, right? And now we're in this world where they control a huge portion of the critical minerals and the manufacturing capability and the machine tooling and all the kind of components that go with those industries. Again, not because there's some inherent natural advantage in China, but because they made a conscious choice to make that a strategic priority of the government and therefore of the industry, to perfect these technologies, to scale them up and to drive them down in cost and to get really good at manufacturing them. We could have done the same thing, a decade ago. So we're now a decade behind, but at least we're finally in the race, and we have the kind of robust industrial strategy that we need to be able to compete on the global stage.
It's funny, even the phrase shovel-ready projects conveys a certain approach to, which I remember from the time, just conveys a certain approach to how you do infrastructure investment and how you do societal capacity, which is well, is it ready to go? Because if not, we're not interested in investing in it.
Yeah.
It's just so different, I think, from...
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. For this crowd, especially, what has not yet been invested in? And we could talk about that from the policy level or from the technologies that the IRA would support if they existed, but that right now don't have firms ready to provide.
Yeah, I think that the two areas that seem most underdeveloped, both in the kind of technology suite and in the policy realm, are industry and agriculture. So if you look at the pie chart of U.S. emissions, right, we have the big ones are transportation, power, and industry. Buildings is a smaller one if you only count direct combustion of fuels in the buildings, but if you count all of the electricity that goes into them, it becomes the biggest wedge. So it depends on how you're thinking about that. And then you have agriculture, which is about 10%, 10 or 11% of our emissions. And so, if we're going to get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions across the whole economy, we have to hit all of those wedges. And I would say if you score IRA on each of them, right, it does pretty darn well on transportation. Right. Again, not just consumer EVs, but there's new business tax credits for medium and heavy duty electric or fuel cell vehicles that I think are going to have a huge impact because businesses are actually much more price responsive and rational than consumer purchase decisions around cars. Right. So if they can save money and, get a competitive advantage by, adopting an EV delivery van like Amazon has running around my neighborhood now, that's going to happen fast, I think, because they have a sustained cost advantage there now. So anyway, transportation, I think, is in pretty good shape. I think power certainly has a big chunk of the emphasis from the legislation, right? And we know we can cut emissions faster and deeper in that sector than really any other, and that it has to grow and expand to help electrify everything else. So that's critical. And then we have a decent amount of support for building electrification and efficiency in the bill as well. Although I should say, I think some of the consumer-facing credits in that case are a little underpowered. Like you can get a $2,000 tax credit to install a heat pump, but if the heat pump install costs 20 grand or 25 grand, which is what a whole home, system might cost these days, it's not a huge incentive to, it's not likely to make a determinative difference for a lot of people. So we maybe could do more in buildings to think about how to do that, or how to couple those incentives with good standard setting and building codes so that, the first time you build something or the first time you go to replace an appliance, you just have efficient options are the only options available. That often is the most, effective way to get that turnover going quickly, and then to buy down the upfront cost of that with these rebates and subsidies. But the ones that are really lacking are in industry and ag. We have a little bit of money for industrial demonstrations, decarbonization demonstrations, about $6 billion in IRA that goes out through the DOE's Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, and that might be able to help fund some creative demonstrations, whether that's industrial electrification or smarter energy efficiency improvements or ways to change out processes or material inputs that can reduce emissions. The 48C advanced manufacturing tax credit, which is supposed to sort of support investments in clean energy manufacturing, actually got modified so that energy efficiency improvements that save on emissions at industrial facilities can also count for that. But that's one of the only credits that's capped at a fixed value. You can only have $10 billion in expenditure on that credit before it's used up, whereas most of them are uncapped. So that's enough to fund maybe 20 billion of public investment. Maybe that makes it something like 30 or so in total. Public and private investment that can get us going, but there's no long-term industrial decarbonization policy driver, right? We don't have any clear incentive for that yet. And then on agriculture, there were some grants in the bill for wildfire mitigation that can help preserve forest stocks, for some creative agricultural conservation programs that might improve soil carbon and things like that. But again, that's it. There's some limited grant programs, really no broader agricultural decarbonization strategy that you can see in the legislation. And I think that's partly a lack of mature technologies that you can point to and say, yeah, that one, let's get that one going. Where you can say that, in the case of hydrogen and carbon capture, which I guess can play a big role in industry, we did do that, right? We gave very specific subsidies for them. So might be a lack of mature technologies, but also I do think, for us policy wonks, it's a lack of thoughtful policy development. There wasn't a very clear policy manual, rating to be inserted into IRA for those sectors the way there was for transportation and buildings and power. And so I think we have our work to do to think very carefully about what a smart innovation strategy looks like, what a smart policy strategy looks like, and what the full suite of technological or behavioral solutions are to tackle those sectors.
It is always funny because you do realize, at this point, I've been covering climate since 2015, which is not as long as you've been in climate, but you do realize how much policy runs slightly ahead of need, but only slightly ahead of need. Yeah. Like when I came, it felt like most people were in power. Transportation had just become the biggest emitting sector of the economy. And since then, there's been more and more focus on transportation. Industry, I think, is getting close to being the biggest emitting sector of the economy. Yep. And now it feels like people are starting to pay attention to industry, but it's like it has a 6-year-olds falling around a soccer ball feel, more than I think people expect who are not kind of in the topic all the time. That being said, this has been a great conversation, and I want to thank our host at SOSV for having us, but I think we're going to have to leave it there. So thank you so much, Jesse, and we'll send it back to you.